Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We're discussing a very important issue. We all know, even now after the election of Donald Trump, that the issue of Ukraine is demanding all our political attention. And I may say, before I introduce our wonderful guest, that of course my political group, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, we have maybe a minority position in this House. We call for greater diplomatic initiatives to end this terrible war. It is certainly a war which we condemn and which we in the first place never wanted to start. But the issue is, how do we end it? That is a political question, however, that is a little bit unrelated to some of the economic discussions of the sanctions. There we want to have a sober discussion. How did these sanctions even work out? What was their effect? What were maybe the intentions, and where did these policies work in the sense what their proponents actually wanted to achieve with them? That is just one of the topics that we want to discuss, and everybody is invited later to also intervene, ask questions, and we're also happy about controversial discussion, of course. We want to create an environment of intellectual honesty where we can discuss these questions openly, and that's why we invited a splendid guest. We will also maybe talk a little bit about the situation now in the United States and the overall economic perspectives that look very grim right now in Europe, and especially in my home country, Germany. Professor Galbraith has tremendous experience in questions of economic policies. He holds a professorship in government at the University of Texas at Austin and the Lloyd and Benson Chair in Government Business Relations in the Johnson School of Public Affairs. In the 80s, he was executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress, and he chaired the Board of Economists for Peace and Security, among many other functions that he held. For example, he served as a chief technical advisor for macroeconomic reform to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic of China. And he won several awards that would be too long, the list, to even read out. But I'm particularly happy to have him here with me because when I was a student of economics in my early 20s, I read the books of his father, who back in the days advised President Kennedy, because it was so hard back in the days as a student of economics who didn't believe always only the markets will fix it story, to find something worth to read. And the books of his father are still worth to read. So I'm delighted to have you here, all the way from, I think, Palau over Switzerland to Brussels. Thank you for being with us. And we titled this event "To Russia with Love?", which indeed is a provocative title. And we did for one reason, because I noticed that you made a study in April 2023, I believe, for the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which was called "The Gift of Sanctions." And I wanted to open the debate with you by asking you what motivated actually this title. How could sanctions be a gift?
Okay, thank you very much. And let me just first of all express my pleasure at being here, and my thanks to you for the invitation. This was indeed based on a paper that appeared in April of 2023, and which has now been published again by the Review of Keynesian Economics, essentially unrevised. And the reason it was not revised is that no revisions seemed required. What I said in 2023 seems to have been borne out by the circumstances since then. Why call it the gift of sanctions? because the intent of the title was to convey the consequences that the sanctions policies actually had on the economy of the Russian Federation, in contrast with the consequences that they were predicted to have. And to use that contrast as a way of advancing an analysis of the underlying ideas, the economic ideas that underpinned the sanctions strategy. The one thing I think I have learned since the original publication of this essay was a little bit more about the importance of the role that sanctions were supposed to play. At the time in 2023, at least to an outside observer, and I'm certainly neither a military nor an intelligence professional, but it was not clear what the military picture, how it would evolve, at least not to an outsider. But to the insiders, I think we now know it was perfectly clear from 2022 onward. And the former Ukrainian foreign minister said in an interview a couple of days ago that the American intelligence was clear on this point in 2022. The military situation was not one in which there was much doubt about which side would prevail. So the burden of the policy fell on the sanctions regime with the idea that it would create terrific damage to the Russian civilian economy, that it would destabilize the Russian financial economy, that it would create difficulties for Russian military production, and that it would bring political pressure to bear on the Russian regime. None of those things happened. And so then the question is, why not? And the interesting thing that I found as I dug into this for the purposes of this paper was that the reason these things did not happen was not that the sanctions failed, not that they were ineffective. Logically speaking, if they had been ineffective, nothing much would have happened. But in fact, observers on both sides, that is to say, American observers, Russian observers, and documentation from both sides, agreed that the sanctions had a terrifically disruptive effect on the Russian economy. They changed a great many things. But they changed them in a way that the Western observers did not anticipate. Rather than causing the Russian economy to enter into a prolonged crisis, and indeed to collapse. And we had prominent, very vocal observers up to at least the start of 2023 and beyond, I think actually middle of 2023 in some cases, claiming that the Russian economy had been permanently damaged and crippled by the sanctions. Whereas we now know that that is not the case. So something was wrong, not with the factual analysis, but with the underlying analytical apparatus. And that's effectively the discussion of the paper. The American observers, the Western observers, implementing the sanctions, believed, and what I think was, in some cases is quite clear, a textbook analysis, which for those of you who have suffered through, let's say, an elementary course in microeconomics, production functions, in which the output is a function of capital, labor, management, and a few other things, including, strangely, money, which really shouldn't be there. But that if you pulled away these ingredients, that the Russian economy would not be able to cope. And the reality was that the sanctions created a business environment in Russia which greatly eased the pursuit of profit by Russian businesses, creating for them a protected market that they didn't have, with less Western competition than was there before, giving them the opportunity to purchase capital equipment at very low prices, according to regulations imposed by the Russian state. Companies left. Using labor and management talent that was already there and that had been cultivated over the previous 20 years. And in a macroeconomic environment in which making business, doing business and making money was possible, they took advantage of it. And the result has been the record, which is now, I think, eminently clear. The Russian economy, after being subjected to the shock, stabilized, began to grow, and has been growing reasonably well ever since. So this suggests to me that what we really face is the necessity of rethinking how we, the West, approaches these questions from an analytical standpoint. And I'd say that without casting any, without trying to offer any opinion on the validity of the objective. But I think it would help in many respects to begin to understand the way in which our economic perspective has been misleading on this and on, I could give you a number of other examples that I think are relevant, but this one is I think, particularly clear.
Thanks so much. Now, let me ask this question. If I remember correctly, there was a Yale professor, Mr. Sonnenfeld, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who, let's say, was the prime witness that basically argued the way that you just described, that the sanctions would damage the Russian economy. What always puzzled me, and maybe we can go through the argument step by step, is somehow the argument was, the sanctions would negatively affect the capacity of Mr. Putin to further engage in a war in Ukraine. So we put all the questions around how and why did this war break out, and the errors the West might have made to the side, and we just focus on that argument. What always puzzled me, I mean, the primary expenditures that Mr. Putin has are being paid in his own currency, right? In the Russian ruble. So could you maybe, give us your view on that argument? So was there even from the beginning to be expected to be a major impact on, at least in the short term, to affect Putin's capacity to wage a war? Or would the argument then be more like, maybe in the long run, we would see some difficulties because he needs maybe foreign exchange to buy, I don't know, like advanced technology from the West that would then limit his ability to, fix airplanes or whatsoever?
I would identify, let's say, half a dozen major objectives of the sanctions strategy. And I'll just run through them very quickly. The first was to cut Russian exports, especially of oil and natural gas. And the purpose of that stated purpose was to reduce the available funding for Russia, supposedly to support the war. The second was to cut Russian imports of key components, equipment, and thereby disrupting industrial production inside Russia. The third was to compel Western firms who occupied major space in the Russian market to leave Russia, thereby presumably immobilizing their assets and activities. The fourth was to encourage the emigration of top talent, particularly in really advanced sectors, information technology, from the Russian Federation. The fifth was to foster capital flight from Russia, and that destabilizing the financial sector and the ruble in particular. And the sixth was to bring pressure to bear on the Russian oligarchs, particularly those who had assets and activities that straddled both Russia and its neighbors, and thereby encourage them to turn against the regime. So one can go, if you want, I can go through those six major elements, which were essentially part of the key points of Sonnenfeld's argument. The first was about the cutting of exports. It's true, Russian exports did fall in quantity terms. But if you're concerned about revenue, that's a question of quantity times price. And the price rose by more than enough to compensate the fall in quantity. So the revenues, export revenues, went up. And in addition to that, the strategy of restricting Russian imports also worked. So the import bill went down and the net export surplus increased even more. So if you think that the Russian Federation had a need of outside funding, the actual effect of the sanctions was to increase it, not to reduce it. However, that's an argument that's of extreme skepticism for the simple reason that Russia already had $600 billion worth of reserves. And a reserve is a reserve. You add to a financial reserve, it's like adding to your bank account. You don't need to do anything with it. It's not affecting your current activity. So that argument struck me as having essentially very little force to begin with. And as you say, for purchases inside the Russian Federation, the Russian government uses its own currency. It doesn't have a shortage of that. Second thing on imports of components, and there was a substantial disruptive effect, no question, nobody disagrees. But already since 2014, Russian firms had been working on insourcing and import substitution in order to improve their capacity to withstand sanctions that have been in place already for a long time. And that you can really break it down into two major groups, non-durables and durables. In non-durables, well, particularly things like food, it's not that hard to develop your own sources of supply. In the case of durables, particularly advanced technology, it's a little more difficult. But the fact is, with durable goods, when you disrupt new production, the old stock is still there. And I make the point that in the United States, between 1942 and 1946, no private automobiles were produced. Well, the country didn't run out of automobiles because the flow of new automobiles is a small fraction of what's out there. And you can make the old stock continue to work. And of course, in this case, it wasn't nearly as serious as that. So the question of Western firms leaving Russia, with greater or lesser difficulty, Russian firms can take over those enterprises, those factories, and certainly the space that's left in those markets becomes open. And that's an exceedingly attractive opportunity from a business standpoint. As far as immigration, there was a certain amount of it. But the fact of the matter there is that immigrants, and particularly of young people, and as a university professor, this is something I've noticed over the years, there are always more young people there to be educated and to take the jobs if somebody leaves them. So this is not something which is a new problem for any country, let alone for capital flight went in both directions. In some cases, people who had capital outside of Russia, began to feel it was threatened, moved it back. Some cases, people took their assets and left permanently. And that effect effectively divided the oligarchs, so far as I could understand, between those who wished to basically evacuate outside Russia, and those people lost their influence inside, and those who felt they would be safer inside Russia, and those people ceased to be a problem from the standpoint of the regime. So the political problem of the oligarchs, Albert Hirschman, someone I knew as a professor many years ago, wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, giving the three options that are available when you have a problem or a dissent from the position of an organization that you're part of. And I think the strategy of sanctions was relying on a certain class of people to take the option of voice and affect the policy of the Russian government. But in fact, they divided between the other two options. Some of them left, exit, some of them stayed, loyalty. And as a result, that particular class ceased to have any significant influence on the course of policy.
So if I understand your argument correctly, and by the way, one has to add maybe that a number of studies now arrived actually at similar results. We even had one study commissioned under the auspices of the German Ministry of Economics, whose minister is in support of the sanctions, who at least found that the sanctions didn't have their intended effect. But if I understand your particular work correctly, actually they provided even an opportunity for Putin to kind of diversify, upgrade its economy, get a tighter grip on the kind of levers with all these oligarchs also having a considerable impact. And in the case of the automotive industry, did you observe, for example, things like China coming in, taking over also the intellectual property and the technical equipment at, let's say, cheaper prices, for example, due to this economic shock of the sanctions? Was there anything particular that you could observe in particular industries?
Well, it is clear that in some cases you seek alternative sources of, let's say, key components or designs from another source. And in the case of automobiles, my understanding is a couple of lines that were soon launched that had old Soviet labels, Lada and Moskvich, but that were basically using the capital equipment that had been left behind. I think, don't hold me to this, but I think Nissan was probably one of them, and designs that came in from China, so the model. So, yeah, this is improvisation. It doesn't immediately replace the production, all of the production that might have been disrupted, but over time, it's a perfectly acceptable substitute. Go ahead.
Well, if we now look at this overall situation, we are currently faced now with a new political situation in the United States after the election of Donald Trump, who at least prior to the election committed to ending this war very soon, as he said. Let's see how successful that endeavor will be. But it's clear that he said he wants to partially retreat from the policy of ever prolonging the war with a supplied delivery of weapons and so on. At the same time, we have a deep economic crisis in Europe, in Germany, for example. The automotive sector is affected not only due to higher energy prices. There's some shifts in the industry. There's a whole debate around the combustion engine and EV cars and many more. However, it is clear that, especially for economy like Germany, which is a huge part, is the biggest economy in the Eurozone, the energy price shock played a considerable role, and matters were made worse by the so-called debt brake and austerity being imposed in reaction to that. And now we have a prolonged recession in the very economy that a few years ago tried to lecture other economies in Europe about the economic prospects. Against this background, if you maybe as an outside observer follow the debates that we have in this house, that we have on the European level, where we now discuss tightening the sanctions, for example, when it comes to Russian fleets, where we prolong guarantees to Ukraine to be able to purchase weapons and so on, while at the same time budget cuts are being imposed on major economies like France. Would you see that as a promising policy mix to address the overall economic malaise in Europe?
That's a question with a great many aspects to it, but let me try to distill a common theme in the question, which is something that one observes with respect to, let's say, domestic economic policy in Europe over recent decades, which is that when a policy is perceived as not succeeding, that is to say, when austerity fails to produce growth, very common experience, the reaction of your well-trained economist is to say you didn't do enough. You weren't austere enough. You should, the punishment should continue until morale improves. That's the approach. And that is the same approach that you're hearing with respect to this policy. And it plainly didn't succeed, or perhaps it wasn't enforced with a sufficient degree of severity, and perhaps more will succeed. This is, I really don't know whether the comment attributed to Einstein is actually one of his or apocryphal, that insanity consists of always doing the same thing and expecting a different result. But it's worth reflecting on whether that's the mental process which is at work here. And the position I would take is that when you clearly see that a policy has failed, and when you can understand as a matter of ordinary business logic why it failed, then perhaps you should consider that the policy wasn't a very good idea from the standpoint of whatever objective you might have had. And in this case, you can see the policy having had reciprocal effects on Europe and on the Russian Federation. One important mirror image is that within the Russian Federation, and partly because exports were curtailed, the price of energy remained stable in ruble terms, may have even fallen a bit. But costs of doing business in Russia did not rise. Costs of doing business in Germany have risen a lot. And the result of that is quite clear in terms of the decisions German industrial firms are currently making with respect to the continuity of their operations. That, I think, is straightforward. You want to make your resources more expensive, you're going to have to take account of the fact that your firms will be less competitive, less profitable, and that they will make investment decisions based on that, on the prospect there. This is the irony. The irony here is, in some sense, it's twofold. And the first is that the sanctions did not fail. They did what they were expected to do. That is to say, they were disruptive, but that the results were the opposite after a short period of adjustment of what they were expected to be. Irony number two is that this is not because the Russian economy is some kind of monster that doesn't obey the laws of economic theory. It's rather that the Russian economy has become, maybe over the past 20, 25 years, an ordinary business economy which does not obey the laws of economic theory because the laws of economic theory do not apply to ordinary business economies. I don't know what they do apply to. Magical economies located on distant exoplanets, perhaps. But it's very hard to find a case of successful application of the ideas behind those theories in the modern world. And so that's where, in some sense, what I'm driving at here is that one can take the Russian sanctions as an example of a really pressing need to reform the way in which we think about, teach, and apply economic principles to the real world.
I said in the beginning of this debate today that, well, at least my political party, we are maybe in a minority position with our view on the how to end the war in Ukraine. However, maybe we are not so much in a minority position if you look at the international world, if you look at the position of the BRICS countries, but inside this house. But wouldn't it be maybe a first step if we now accept the fact that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, that Europe also starts to to voice more clearly its own interests, because it is my impression that, I mean, whatever you may say about the roots of this war and how it will be turning out, it is definitely not in the overall economic and political interest of the European Union to have this war first, to prolong it for longer and sustained periods of times. But also, if you look at the kind of dependencies that the German economy, for example, had from cheap Russian gas, how would you think would a Trump administration react to Europe turning to formulate again its own interests and to try also maybe to have a more kind of equilibrating relationship with the United States, but also with Russia, and to try to solve these conflicts peacefully?
Well, I'm going to refrain from making policy recommendations on how to get out of this imbroglio, because frankly, I think it will be very difficult to escape from it. The line of argument I would offer is that we, first of all, know that there's no military success in prospect. And secondly, we know that the alternative, which was really the strategy, which was to break the will of the Russian Federation, isn't going to work either. Certainly not in strategy that's based on either economic or political actions. And the belief that it would break was, as I say, was the larger misimpression, that's a polite word, of Western decision makers, because I think we know now that their military and intelligence professionals were doing their job correctly and telling them essentially what they understood to be the truth of the matter. But it was the economists and the people who had studied a little economics who went confidently forward on the assumption that they could make a difference in the terms of the way the policy of the other side would be conducted. And this reflects, unfortunately, a certain hubris and a certain, let's say, tendency toward fantastical beliefs, which has become quite characteristic of them. And now you've got the two sides that are basically aligned, because we now understand. I think actually Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor in the United States, made a comment yesterday and the day before that they recognized that the sanctions did not have the effects. Whether he understood the reason that they did not have the effects that they sought is not clear to me from what I saw of the remark. But there's an understanding that the policy is not a success. So now the question facing the incoming administration, what do you do? What do you do given that you're under a certain level of political constraint in terms of what you can admit to in the situation? And I am not close enough to President-elect and former President Trump to be able to give you any deep insight into how he is going to proceed. We'll see, I think is the best I can say. But I have been carefully removing myself from this Washington scene for the last 40 years in order precisely to be able to avoid having to try to prognosticate about what American political leaderships might do when faced with really difficult or, in fact, impossible problems.
Well, maybe then before I open the floor to questions and remarks, do you have any expectation on how the Trump administration will engage when it comes to China, like hardening also economic conflict there, their kind of trade policies? And if you were a European policymaker, what would maybe be your strategy for prepare for what lies ahead? Or would you also not feel in a position to have?
Oh, I don't want to duck these questions. I'm just saying that with respect to China, we've been in a deepening, let's say, economic conflict, if you like, since well into the first Trump presidency. It didn't end in the Biden presidency. They did not remove the tariffs on China. And they're likely to be intensified. In fact, the staff who handled trade policy in the first Trump administration are likely to be back. Robert Lighthizer, special trade representative. So I think it's not beyond, you can make a reasonable prediction that they will follow the same strategy. The Biden administration complemented the tariff strategy, complemented with an E, the tariff strategy with an industrial subsidy strategy and tax rebate strategy intended to promote the production of renewable energy in the United States, to promote to basically secure the semiconductor supply chain inside the United States. And those efforts, I would imagine, will continue. I don't know that they will for a fact, but I think they probably will. I do not think that they stand a very big chance of success in the case of semiconductors, because it's intrinsically a global supply chain. And it's extremely difficult to, even for a country the scale of the United States, to establish a wholly or largely domestic semiconductor supply chain for the scale of the American consumer market when your principal peer competitor has a population 4 times as large, and the cross-strait trade relations with Taiwan, which supplies a large number of the chips. So it's hard for me to see, and I think the U.S. administration in the Biden years actually at some level understood this, that if the semiconductor supply chain is broken, it's not going to be the American firms that are going to have the competitive edge, because basically the scale economies and the returns to research and development will continue to advance in the larger market, which is China.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for listening in for our first 45 minutes of discussion. Subject that I think will haunt Europe and the European Parliament for the years to come, because we are now faced with a country in Ukraine which has basically destroyed infrastructure, over 1 million dead people. A lot of the people that remain behind are wounded, traumatized elderly people. So we'll be faced in the coming years also how to manage that crisis, with Donald Trump probably not being all too prepared to help Europe in managing a situation in which we maneuvered ourselves in. So now I think that alone is a reason for why we should, apart from the big plenary debates we have in the European Parliament, much more seriously and concentrated engage with that issue.
One other thought that's been sort of in the back of my mind here, and that coming back to the question of sanctions, the thing to understand and to tie up the question of why I called this paper The Gift of Sanctions, is that the policies that the Russian government took beginning in 2022 were not policies that they would have taken on their own. They would not have basically pressured the oligarchs to break their ties to the West or to choose between the two sides. They would certainly not have expelled Western firms. They would not have pursued the kind of industrial independence that they've been obliged to pursue. These were measures that became possible to the Russian Federation as a result of the sanctions. And so one has to understand. And the reason for this is it wouldn't have done this because it would have been politically difficult, it would have been legally difficult, and it would have been ideologically very difficult because of the continued very strong influence of neoliberal thinking inside Russia at that time. And the West then gave them the conditions under which they create a business climate was far more favorable to Russian businesses than would have been possible. So just bear in mind that it's not just that the sanctions didn't have their results, and not just that the Western the economic theories that underpinned them was completely off base. It was that the policies themselves would not have been in place except for the sanctions.
So now our job as a European Parliament is certainly we will care a lot about our own economies, I hope, in the years to come, and also about the societies we live in. And we are now faced with a very serious consequence of this terrible war and the terrible destructions. And that is why we try to facilitate these discussions, because we think we need to engage also across political groups to have a climate of also intellectual honesty, whether the policies the EU embarked on worked. In that spirit, I want to open the floor. Every contribution is welcome. It can be critical of what Mr. Galbraith or I was saying, so there's no problem at all. Just be brief, say your name and who you are, and then the floor is yours. I will try to collect. I may not always be able to approach everyone with his or her name, but just help me a little bit, and then we get the discussion going. So first, the gentleman in the first row, and I'll.
Thank you very much for organizing this, and thanks, Professor, for your views. I have a quick comment and a question. My name is Simone Rodino, and I work for the European Commission. And I have a feel that many of our policies, they are not really grounded in empiricism. So perhaps this has been the case as well. My direct experience is on official development assistance, and it's very difficult to have databases, factual databases, kind of econometric analysis that help us in benchmarking what we do compared to what others do. Something that would give us a stronger scientific, if you want, basis. I wonder whether something like that would have been possible in this case. Do you have any experience of analysis, for example, of sanctions that in the past worked by trying to make reference to databases that might be stretching, even several decades? You have articulated the reasons for the sanctions into 10 different chapters, trying to have something that is very evidence-related to the past. I think that the EU so far has sanctioned against 20 or 30 countries. Of course, many other countries have imposed sanctions. Would that have been something that could have been helpful? Or do you feel that there are too many variables at play and is not something really viable? Thanks.
I'm entirely in favor of bringing evidence to bear on these problems. And a great deal of our difficulty here is the tendency in the economics profession to move directly from first principles to policy without any intervening sort of reality check. There are different approaches to the question of evidence, and it's fair to say that there's been a certain amount of movement in the direction of assessing evidence in economic literature. The difficulty I have with some of it is that it narrows the question to the point where you might get something that looks like a statistical answer. And the real problem here is having a framework which is consistent with the operation of the real world. And that, in some sense, if I had to characterize this in perhaps slightly abstract terms, I would say that the problem that we have is that we have an economics which is rooted in a concept of equilibrium, which basically had departed all other sciences sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and as part of an earlier intellectual framework. Whereas practically anything else that's done with respect to evidence and analysis is done in an evolutionary framework consistent with, among other things, the entropy law, the second law of thermodynamics. And that's not an equilibrium framework at all. You have to look at the conditions affecting a particular society at a particular moment. And that requires, in some sense, reframing the way in which we do economics. Not inconsistent with the way it was once done. In, for example, the American New Deal, case that I know pretty well, or in the post-war reconstruction of Europe, this was carried out by people who were, in fact, economists, and so considered at the time, but who were basing their action on their direct knowledge of circumstances and the experiences that they had in dealing with the Depression, the war, the circumstances of the Cold War. And that's, in fact, the kind of intellectual tradition that I think we should be focused on attempting to restore.
I saw a number of hands. I saw them all. I will change a little bit. I saw my colleague Michael, for example. But I'll first move on to the lady here that raised her hand, and then Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentation and your thoughts about the sanctions and economical theory. My name is Renat Robert, and I have just one question. If I just dial back to the sentence that Mr. Galbraith said, punishment should continue until the morale improves. And it was said with regards to austerity measures. But if you look at today's article, op-ed article of Joseph Borrell in the Foreign Policy, he says that we're not naive and sanctions can be circumvented, but still they are in place because it shows an example. And I want to make a small comment that punishment should continue until the morale improves, and there are clear signs in the Russian economy why it doesn't work. And yes, as you said, prices in Russia remain the same, can be argued, evidence-based, coming to the previous comments. And the point is, sanctions, it's not just a part of economics, it's a part of politics. And it's a part of the question, if we as international society, community, end up in anarchy or not. There is no one sharif which just sanctions one country because it behaves in the wrong way. This is kind of a way it is done, and it should be done. Otherwise, all the countries, as Borrell rightly points out, it will be followed by many countries, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, in the US as well. Thank you.
I'm not sure I got the full thrust of your question or your comment, but since you mentioned a number of other cases where sanctions have been applied, I'll just say a word about that. I was in Cuba in early June, and there's no question that the sanctions against Cuba are having a crushing effect on the Cuban civilian population. I've been there a number of times, and I saw hunger in Havana that I've not seen before. Why is that? Because the sanctions that were put in place at the end of the first Trump term have done enormous damage to, in particular, the tourist trade from Europe, which was a major bulwark of the Cuban economy. And this is, when you're dealing with a small and vulnerable economy such as Cuba, the sanctions can be really quite devastating. I think I'm not that familiar with Venezuela, but that I think that has also been hit very hard by sanctions. Iran, more intermediate case, a much larger country with much stronger resource base. But when we're talking about the Russian Federation, with 145 million people and 1/3 of the resource base of the world, and a very strong scientific and engineering community and technical capacities that are peerless in important respects, then we're talking about an economy where the effects here are as I've described, that they, in fact, they were much more vulnerable and weaker before the sanctions than afterwards, and which also raises the question: what happens if you remove them? Would it really? What would they do? Would they go back to the way they were before? I think the answer to that is no. That you would see a further development based upon the strengthening that has already occurred. So that, again, for the policymakers, is a dilemma, but my suggestion is that one needs to have policymakers who can think clearly about these questions so that they're not constantly barging down, into cul-de-sacs from which they can't escape.
And if I just make comment about just Russian strengths, clearly, if you go to the recent news on impact of sanctions on Russian economy, well, arguing all this scientific research, there is no reason just to argue that scientific and special engineering and ability of Russia to be resistant, it is there. And especially when it comes to circumventions of sanctions via Kazakhstan, Turkey, Azerbaijan, many, many, many more. But the point is, what kind of country with a strong economy which can resist for years from to sanctions would pay and import butter from Saudi Arabia? There were 20 tons of butter which were imported from Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the domestic economy of butter in Russia, it was booming, whatever, before 2022. Right now, where is it? The same, even Moscow Times reports that many companies in Russia will be broke by the end of 2025. So it's the part, it explains why the Ministry of Defense of Russia is right now The Economist. It's all about the economy. It's all about their abilities to resist, but it's also about the ability of Western policymakers, decision makers, IMF, World Trade Organization, which is not really working in a really efficient way. It's their ability to counteract. Because as I say, the Minister of Defense in Russia is the previous economist. Thank you. And there are clear signs which say that the sanctions are really working. Thank you. That's my last comment.
Okay. Thanks for that perspective. I will then continue with my colleague Michael in the back, and he's a very good chap to have a conversation with because he was professionally involved with peace processes in Sierra Leone, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and many countries. So, Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, I didn't want to speak about the peace process. Thank you very much, Professor Gorbers, for coming here and telling us all this one. I would like to speak about the BRICS countries. I hope I said this time the right word. Russia is a leading member of BRICS Plus, and even the summit took place this year, the summit of BRICS in Russia. Now, the joint economies of even the founding members of the United States is about 3 times that of the European Union. These are countries which have substantially greater economic growth rates than the European Union, and their share, I don't know now the figures here, the share in international trade of BRICS Plus is much higher than that of the European Union. Also, the trade among BRICS countries are increasingly in national currencies and not anymore in US dollars. So how do you feel that this whole complex of BRICS, in which Russia is a part, plays a role of reducing the impact of any sanctions? Have you given that any thought?
So far as I'm aware, I don't think that the existence of the BRICS as such has been to effectively counter or render the sanctions ineffective. Again, if there had been no effect, then there would have been no change. But you see major changes, and so that is a testimony to that the sanctions did in fact influence the course of Russian development, and the Russian Academy of Sciences agrees with that assessment. Now, I quote a report from September of 2022, which said that the sanctions had a major crisis impact on all sectors of the Russian economy. So from that standpoint, the analysis of Sonnenfeld and the analysis of the Russian Academy of Sciences were not in disagreement. It's the question of what happened then. What's the role of BRICS? It's a forum. It's an important forum. It's a diplomatic forum. It illustrates let's just say, neutral attitude or the independent attitude of the major powers who are participants in BRICS. And it is to some extent an umbrella under which trade settlements can begin to be made. The payments can begin to be made in the national currencies rather than passing through the U.S. financial system and by the means of the dollar. And that's underway. And that is, I think, a significant straw in the wind. But the question that people are really talking about is, does this mean that the reserve role of the U.S. Treasury bond, and by extension the euro, is going to come to an end? And on that point, I have a good deal of skepticism. So far, there's been no discernible effect on the dollar exchange rate, which is a bit of a shame because in order to restore industrial capacity in the United States, a lower dollar and a less important financial sector of the U.S. are indispensable. That hasn't happened. And for the time being, it may well not happen. And the reason for that is that there is no clear-cut alternative and no liquid market in a large alternative asset or some kind of mixture of assets that would be serve as an alternative reserve. Now, some countries, China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, I think substantially to increase its stockpiles of physical materials. And that, they have their reasons for doing that. But let's just say reserve currency arrangements have enormous amounts of inertia. The major threat to those arrangements and that status is, so far as I see it, coming from the threat of confiscation of assets. And if you find that you cannot securely hold your assets in the bonds of a country whose foreign policy you may disagree with, then you are going to feel much stronger impetus to changing how you hold your reserves. And that process is underway now. And I think that we haven't seen major implications of it yet. It's a game with an uncertain outcome at this point.
And my colleague Nikos Papandreou from
Greece, MEP, for the Socialists and Democrats. Very good discussion. We should have more of these in the Parliament because there's a narrative, sort of a wind-sweeping narrative, that all these things make sense. And of course, the sanctions I wasn't happy with in the beginning. I think the one thing of the 6 points which are economic, the seventh, which I think our friend pointed out, is there's a moral element to the sanctions. You have to punish the Russians. And even though the sanctions didn't work, there's this idea of punish them and also in terms of voice to get the people to rise up against Putin by making things so bad. Remember the sanctions in Iraq were not so much on oil as much as to get rid of Saddam, that life is awful. So these things don't work. Even South Africa, how many years it took with the embargo. So but the argument that our friend Michal said about the BRICS, I would say China and India, didn't they help reduce the effectiveness of the sanctions because they're big importers and at a discount, of course, from the other countries. You said maybe that's not the case, but I think they're importing at least 50 billion worth a year. So they got out of the sanctions, that part of it. And finally, as you say, the economists completely misread the power of the flexibility of the Russian economy to deal with the sanctions. So it was like a knee-jerk reaction by the politicians who thought sanctions would hurt Russia, and in the end, it didn't hurt Russia, which is a good question. If it's not hurting Russia, although our friend was saying it maybe does hurt Russia, what happens if you release them? Because it's also hurting Europe. Pure utilitarian argument. So what about China and India? I'm sure you have the answer to that. That's why I'm asking. Thank you.
Well, the question as it affects, let's say, the shipment of oil through India to Europe is a question of European demand for oil. That's why it's happening, right? No, well, China uses certainly. But that then again raises the question of what exactly is Russia's need for European money? And the answer to that is, well, I mean, it's a business for the Russian oil exporters, surely. But Russia as a country, does not need European money or American money. So if you didn't have the export of oil, the oil would stay in the ground. I mean, it might have a problem with the continuity of the equipment and that kind of thing. But apart from that, it's really hard for me to see how this would affect the course of events, either in the Russian economy as a whole or in the war. Say what? Well, fine. The Indians and the China are making a profit on it. And I suppose I don't know exactly what the commercial terms with the Chinese are. But the impact of all of that on the effectiveness of the objectives of the policy seems to me at best second order. What we do observe is that the cost of resources in Europe has gone up dramatically because you have oil that you're paying a markup to third countries, and you have natural gas, which now has to be liquefied and brought in, and that's more expensive. And you're trying to run an industrial system on resources that are substantially more expensive than they are, not only in other parts of Eurasia, but in the United States. With the result, which I assure you the incoming administration will have no problem with, that European companies will find it advantageous to do future investment in the United States. As long as the Permian Basin is, basically producing oil and gas at the current rates, and we don't know the answer. It's a geological question mark, at least so far as I know, and I live in Texas. But the fact is that you can be, I think, quite sure that the Trump administration will be putting the interests of the American economy first on that demand.
So, if I understand correctly, that exchange. So you're basically saying there might have an impact, like China and India might have helped Russia to better sustain certain policies, but it didn't affect them. That didn't have so much an impact anyway on the capacity to wage the war, because they're paying their soldiers, I don't know, in ruble, and whatever problems they may have encountered on the technological front, that wasn't so decisive anyway. So it helped them, but not so much with an eye to the war itself.
If you at the stated objectives of the sanctions, and let's say stated by the United States government, but then that's somewhat more broadly by people like Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, it's hard to find any case that those objectives have been met by the policy. Quite clear that the opposite is in fact occurred so far. Whether something will happen down the road, that's always a possibility. I can't foresee the future. That maybe in 2 years the Russian economy will once again crash and collapse. But maybe the American or the European economy will collapse first. These things are out of our sphere of knowledge. What we can say is that certain predictions were made with great confidence, with enormous reach in some sense. It was exceedingly difficult to swim against the tide of those comments. And I did so in a way which was very carefully phrased, and I hope I've maintained that today. But they were very wrong. They did not get it right. And the question of reversing from a policy which is producing the results that we observe is not an easy question. You can't simply roll back the clock and expect to go back to 2021 or to the offers that were being made for mutual security at the end of that year. We're in a different world now.
So next was Mark Potenga from Belgium.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I'm also a member of the European Parliament for the Left Group. I'm going a little bit in the same direction as the colleague before. One of the things I think a couple of weeks ago, The Economist came with an article saying that Russia now spends about a third of its national budget on defense, which obviously is kind of starving the investment or the expense that it can do on the civilian side of it. Now, aside from the political dimension of having a neighbor with a heavily militarized economy, and the part that the war obviously is playing on that, my first question would be, have sanctions contributed to this in any way, or is it purely or mostly a war-related dimension? But secondly, the idea of regime change or weakening, let's say, weakening of the political system in Russia, which is something that indeed has been tried in through sanctions in Cuba, or is being tried in Cuba, in Iran, where the idea would be we create this political upheaval in Russia, destabilize it, and hence, through the militarization of the economy, the starving of the civilian part of the economy, public dissatisfaction will increase, be it on butter, be it on something else. Is that something you see happening? Because that's more and more a narrative you see now in EU establishment circles. I'd personally argue that the track record on this is not impressive. I mean, it's failed in Iran, Cuba, Venezuela. So, but it is an argument that's being put forward. So I'd very much appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you.
I think you're right about Cuba and Venezuela, that the populations have withstood an enormous amount of privation. I have to say, I fret about Cuba because you're looking at serious levels of suffering, which was, briefly in the special period, well, for a certain period of time you saw that, but Cuba's always had a rather austere form of socialism. The conditions now are exceedingly tough. But as you say, the Cuban government has survived since 1959 under those pressures, and Venezuela likewise. The case in Russia is entirely different, so far as I understand it, in the sense that not only has this not had the effect on the war economy, it has also had the opposite effect on the civilian economy. With the management that we have seen, the civilian economy in Russia appears, according to anything that I'm aware of, to be thriving. Then the IMF now classes it as the fourth largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity terms, after China, the United States, and India. So ahead of Japan, which is quite something. So I would put it in a class with the management of the US economy in the Second World War, when total GDP doubled in 4 years, and the civilian economy maintained at least its original 1941 size through the end of 1945. That was a management. I have to say, I have a certain amount of family pride in that, because my father was responsible for price control during that war for the first year after Pearl Harbor. But nevertheless, that's an example of the successful management of an economy, which was also, as is the case here, substantially reduced in its access to the resources of the rest of the world because of the conditions of the war. Again, it's not like surviving under tough conditions to which you are vulnerable. It is, in fact, prospering under conditions that were made possible by the sanctions themselves.
Then I saw Sophie Rauser, and I'll continue.
Yes, Sophie Rauser, working for the Left Group as a staff for 15 years in this house now. Thank you very much for your intervention, and thank you, Fabio, for organizing this hearing. I feel really ashamed that we are so few in the room, but at least you get to see how heterodox is your line of thinking in this house, unfortunately. I had two questions, one purely about economy, which is, could you go back a bit in time when we applied one of the very first set of sanctions against Russia, which was to ban them from the SWIFT banking system, and explain to someone like me who has very little economic knowledge how this worked out also in the end for Russia. And at the time in France, we had an economist that you probably know, Thomas Piketty, who said that this SWIFT ban would not be efficient as long as there wouldn't be a very strong register on tax haven for really to pursue and hunt down the Russian oligarch. What also would be your line of thinking on this? And my second question, we talked a bit about the impact of sanction on the Russian economy itself, but also from a more geopolitical point of view, we also hinted that somehow we further increased the cooperation between Russia and China. You also said a bit what was Donald Trump's probable vision for the US-China relationship. I would like to also hear a bit your line of thinking on what could be or should be done from an economic point of view for the EU as regards relationship with China. Thank you.
Let me see if I can keep all of those in mind. On SWIFT, and the first consequence of the financial sanctions at the start of the escalation in February of 2022 was, if I recall the numbers correctly, that the ruble crashed from about 60 to about 100 to the dollar, I think, in that general range. But then it recovered. Right? So, and the surge of inflation that brought about was brought rather quickly under control. So that's actually all in that story is in the report of the Russian Academy of Sciences that I reference in my paper. Why were they able to do this quite as quickly and effectively as they were? I don't have deep insight into the internal preparations in the Russian financial system, but my impression is that this was, of course, it had been threatened, and probably the threats had been going on for some years since the Crimean annexation in 2014, and so they had ample time to prepare an alternative internal payments mechanism. So I think that's the essence of it. And since most payments are in fact internal, then the disruption of being cut off from SWIFT and transactions, cross-border transactions, was not all that dramatic in its effect. That's my basic understanding of that situation. And of course, the sanctions operate essentially like capital controls, which countries can and do impose. They were imposed by the European Community on Greece in 2015 in advance of the Greek referendum. And they were imposed on Cyprus before that. So managing a situation in which your trans-border flows are subject to control is not an unknown problem. And China has maintained capital controls continuously. Okay, so that's, I think, somewhat responsive to your first question. The extent of increasing cooperation between Russia and China, well, obviously, a certain amount of trade diversion has occurred. I actually don't know how substantial that is, or how to say whether it would have been substantially less under some alternative scenario, because obviously the relationships between these two economies are going to develop as neighbors as they both grow, and particularly as the Russian economy grows as a consumer of Chinese goods. But that's not a new thing. Those relationships have been there for a long time. Chinese firms, I'm sure, have moved into some degree to the space that Western Japanese firms were pressured to abandon. The larger question is the more geopolitical question. And it is quite striking to me that the United States in particular has maneuvered to a position in which both Russia and China consider the US and the West to be adversaries. This was something that, was the staple of world politics from the 1950s, from let's say 1958, when the Soviets and the Chinese, split in the direction of their policies. And Richard Nixon took advantage of it in 1971-72 when he sent Kissinger to Beijing. Right? That was to triangulate between the Soviets and the Chinese, because he recognized that we're dealing here with great powers. And we would need to have at least neutral relations with one of them if we're going to have, successful position in the world with respect to the general balance. Somehow in the 1990s, it seems to me, the leaders of the West got the impression that they were on the cusp of a world order which would be managed in some broadly accepted way by the United States, and that everybody else would simply fall in line. And they've been working under this impression, some of these people continuously ever since. And those people are still to this day in dominant positions in American foreign policy establishment. And the reality is China's a larger economy than the United States. That was not true in the 1990s. But it is now a large and very powerful economy, and the gravity of world trade goes toward the largest economy. And Russia is not the Russia of the collapsed Russia of the 1990s. It's a well-organized, relatively speaking, certainly by Russian historical standards and late Soviet standards, a well-organized industrial economy with a very strong resource base and scientific base. And countries in that position are to be taken seriously. They're going to be there no matter what. If we don't somehow end up in a catastrophe that finishes all off, both of these countries are going to be there indefinitely. That's just the reality, it seems to me.
Thank you very much. I'm Klaus Diekmann, an economics student at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. My question, well, to my mind, the Putin regime, and including the central bank, the Russian central bank, has always had a solid reputation when it comes to adhering to economic orthodoxy, or what you might describe as textbook economics. Now, 4 years ago, you participated in a very remarkable panel at the Gaidar Forum. Your co-panelists were Kenneth Rogoff, whom one can safely describe as one of the foremost advocates of textbook economics, as well as a young gentleman who was then the Russian Minister of the Economy, Maxim Oreshkin, and today is one of Putin's most senior economic advisors. The topic of the panel was modern monetary theory, a heterodox school of economics. And interestingly, Mr. Oreshkin was rather positively disposed towards your dissenting opinion on the matter. And I would be very interested to hear what your perception is of the current Russian policymaking establishment, whether they are maybe shifting into more heterodox spaces, if there is currently a discussion about moving, about maybe also leaving behind textbook economics, and what role that might have played when it came to possibly preparing for sanctions, and what role that might also play in decades to come. Thank you very much.
That was a very interesting occasion, and it was at the Gaidar Forum in 2020. I can't really speak with authority about the inner workings of the Russian economic community. I have certain, long-standing professional relationships there, but it's hard for me to judge how they fit into the the picture of a state which is, I'm not close enough, and my Russian isn't good enough to really give you a good answer on that. I will say that I think that the Russian state has pursued a very strongly pro-social policy that, among other things, understanding clearly that they face a terrific long-term demographic challenge. And the problem of demography was greatly aggravated by the 1990s when the birth cohort was extremely small. And so to compensate for that, they have been very strongly supportive of family development, large families, and the social conditions, that is to say, education, kindergartens, you name it, to make it, let's say, to support family population policy. Otherwise, 2018, when I was there, I was told that they were losing 1 million people a year from the labor force just from retirements. That was one of the reasons they increased the retirement age, which was quite an unpopular policy. So they needed to stretch out people's work lives too. So that, and you can see this, and you can see this in the in the speeches of the Russian leadership that they emphasize these factors. That they were open to have a discussion about modern monetary theory was certainly very interesting. I really cannot say to what extent there's a sort of these ideas are incorporated into Russian official thinking, but it was it's I think it's pretty clear to me that they're following a fairly pragmatic course, driven by the two priorities. One of which is to maintain the positive direction of social conditions in Russia, which are dramatically better than they were 30 years ago. Without any comparison. And secondly, to of course maintain the military effort that they need to maintain in order to ensure not only that they prevail in the conflict that they're in, but also that they present let's say, a very strong position vis-a-vis any larger conflict that might happen later. So those two things are, when you have to do what you have to do, then economic ideologies tend to become much more flexible. Well, we saw this in the West as well with COVID, that a great deal of dogma about debt and so forth is, we have a pandemic and we're going to just set it aside. In the United States, a vast amount of money went out to support people who were unemployed, to the extent that maybe 30% of the American workforce got more income unemployed than they were making before. And their savings rate went up to about a third of income for a brief period. So this shows you that, in fact, this is let's just say that the description of the financial world, which is called MMT, modern money theory, is in fact an accurate description of the world. I have never thought otherwise, and I predate the MMT group. They're generally a younger generation. But I got my monetary economics at Cambridge, and it's essentially Keynes's monetary economics, so it was not unfamiliar to me from the beginning. And of course, the problem is that the textbooks give you a completely different and completely fallacious story, which is yet another thing that we need to work on in order to make sure the next generation doesn't go down the same path.
Yeah, we took a quick deep dive into economic theory for those among our viewers who don't know exactly what that is. It's basically an economic paradigm that says that fiscal deficits do matter less than they're currently perceived, for example, in the European Union, only when like inflation kicks in, so that fiscal deficits should more stabilize inflation, and we should not care so much about like deficit limits and these kind of things. But I think we spent a good 1.5 hours with a very interesting and fruitful discussion. Did I overlook somebody who tried to get the word and I ignored it? Then you're the lucky last person to intervene.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting discussion, also presentation. I'm Rubin Hagels. I'm also a student in the Berlin School of Economics and Law. And I had a question to your last comment after your presentation, saying that the sanctions also created an environment for business elites and also the state to align their interest. And I was wondering, in what terms is this important in such an authoritarian state like Russia, with a really strict leader like Putin? And would this mean that there would have been an opportunity for the Western countries to use this as a leverage if we didn't impose sanctions? Or if I misunderstood you in this point? Yeah, that's it.
The echo is
could you repeat that last part?
Yeah, you were saying about the sanctions creating an environment for business interest and the state interest to align. And I was wondering about in what way this could have been used as leverage if these sanctions weren't imposed. So if you were saying the business elites had to rethink their neoliberal thinking in regards of business relations to the West, would this have been a point of leverage for the EU to redirect their reaction towards Russia?
And I'm not quite sure I understood the question. What is the this?
The this is that, if I understand correctly, that the Russians would have to rethink the whole economic paradigm as they were embarking on more like liberal economic policies in some way, and whether this would have been a leverage for the European Union to do what exactly?
To perceive a different kind of sanctioning. For example, saying that we have business people having a different goal than the state.
I think I've got it. And let me answer it this way. I don't think the ideas that animate economic thinking in the Russian Federation are all that different from the ideas that once animated economic thinking in Germany, France, Japan, or even People's Republic of China. That these were ideas which were in all cases substantially influenced by the New Deal in the United States. That is to say that they take as a point of departure that, first of all, things happen according to plans, that businesses follow the lead of that is set by the broad structure of national policy. This was true, for example, the Monet plans in the reconstruction of France, or the basic coordination in German reconstruction between the very centralized, concentrated banking sector and the German industrial development, along with the trade unions, of course. And then you look at Japan, or you look at the Republic of Korea, and you look at China, and you find essentially the same broad structure. It is not a neoliberal structure. This was the illusion that built up over the last 30 or 40 years, that that the world behaved as if we were a set of decentralized competitive units without any direction from a central, let's say an entity capable of making policy about the future of technology and the future structures of society. That was not the way in which Europe came back from the Second World War. It was not the way in which Roosevelt brought the United States out of the Depression. And those models are very prevalent in China and in Russia. I will tell you a small story about going to China in 1993 to audition, in effect, for an assignment to be an advisor to the State Planning Commission. And I was invited to give 8 hours of lectures over 2 days. And I had a weekend to prepare them. And so they gave me a whole list of questions about, American policymaking, this kind of thing. So I prepared lectures and I gave them. And on the fourth day, and it was an audience of about this size of basically section chiefs in the Planning Commission. And on the fourth day, the fourth session, they all came with internally translated copies of my father's book on price control. Needless to say, no royalties had been paid, and and would I please sign them as a token, which of course I happily did. So just recognize that there's not such a thing that there are fundamentally new ideas here. There's better ideas and diluted ideas. And I would argue that the economics profession has put Europe, in Europe more than the United States, but also the United States, in a box, in a cul-de-sac that needs to be broken out of by understanding what the past actually consists of. And once that happens, and how businesses actually work, and once that happens, at least you'll have the questions framed. Whether Europe can escape from this problem, given that, for example, the links of, let's say, inexpensive natural resources, particularly natural gas from Russia, have been broken. That's another issue. That may be an exceedingly difficult problem to solve because, quite frankly, the Russians don't have much interest in the European market anymore.
Well, the issue of price controls is actually a very interesting one to end such a debate with, because actually in Germany we had a young female economist, Isabella Weber, who basically argued in favor of price control, and she was lambasted. And later, when the energy price shock took its full course, she was then nominated, I think, by Bloomberg as one of the most influential economic thinkers of our time. So this shows you how the economic discourse under crisis can change. Let me just say, Isabella is someone I admire very greatly, and she's a dear friend. But her expertise is in China. She did an enormous amount of field work. She speaks Chinese. She investigated the Chinese development strategy very, very carefully, wrote a very important book, the breakthrough book. And what did she find when she got to China? Well, she found, among other things, that they were interested. They knew very well what the U.S. had done during the Second World War. So it all sort of comes around in some sense. This is, again, there is an intellectual unity and community here. And the problem, of course, is that it doesn't hold any of the high terrain in the so-called economics profession. That's a problem of the economics profession. That's a very good statement to end such a discussion with. I want to thank all the participants for participating well, first of all. Secondly, engaging in a very open and fruitful debate, I think. We will certainly continue to discuss these topics in the European Parliament, in the European Commission, in the member states that part of us were elected in. And I want to thank you for coming here at this late hour on Monday. And I want to thank foremost our dear guests for having traveled all that long way to see us, to engage with us. And I wish you personally all the best, and I wish us good luck in navigating the multiple crises in the European Union. Thank you very much.